Home is such an important, foundational, and fundamental thing in our lives. Academic achievement, job, workforce development, education, health, all of those things start to rest on that baseline of a good, solid place to live. And there's a difference in my mind between housing and home.
As a parent, a single parent, that was essential for my children to know that Jesus Christ is a part of their life, and that stability piece for them to have a safe place to live, a place to do their homework, a place to eat, a place to rest and relax and feel love and support.
I grew up in a very loving family, very nice home. With that privilege comes a lot of opportunity, and I think that's the big difference. When I first got involved with Urban Homeworks, I realized that some people don't have that stable house or home to go to. And I've just learned how important it is to have a home.
In my line of work, I see mismanaged rental properties, severely dilapidated. It can have holes in the walls, it can have appliances that aren't working, it can have furnaces that aren't working. And we at Urban Homeworks have tried to flip the rental script and have residents have a more dignified rental experience.
We try to incorporate local women and minority contractors, the ideal being that the money we spend on rehabbing or building a home flow through the community.
The challenges of housing is a symptom of a much deeper challenge in our society. We're finding ourselves all bundled up with the relationships that we all have together in places like North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis and Frogtown. That concentrated economic exclusion is going to take a lot of concentrated economic and human investment as we move forward.
The volunteers are really the bedrock in reducing our costs. Their labor and their efforts and their donations, help make the project possible.
When you have a place to call home that you can afford, you are able to concentrate more about how to attain more and sustain that stability.
My upbringing wasn't necessarily bad, but I was house to house. So being stable and for me having a home is really important, mainly because of my kids.
About 15 years ago, I was homeless and not having a consistent place to go. One of my friends let me come stay with her, and I always prayed and said, when I get my own, that'll never happen to me again. From my heart, Urban Homeworks has been wonderful for me and my family. It's not like having somewhere you can come to every day. You can stick your key in and come in, that is very, very special. Wonderful for a person to have somewhere they can go and call home. Even if it ain't nothing but a one bedroom, that's still home.
The mission of Urban Homeworks is to perpetuate the hope of Jesus Christ through innovative community development that produces equitable, dignified housing, a strategic network of good neighbors, and the redemptive development of real estate. And all that means is that we're using housing as a way to build power and efficacy in the community. What we're trying to do at Urban Homeworks is to not just build some housing, but to build a community of people that call a place home, that can not just live there, but can have some control and say over their own environment and their own space.
Greetings, everyone. Greetings. My name is Paula Haywood, and I am the board chair for Urban Homeworks. It is my pleasure to welcome you today. For 20 years, Urban Homeworks has cultivated hope, motivated communities, transformed families from homelessness to home ownership. In a dignified way, partnering with community providers to empower neighbors to see the value of authentic inclusivity. It is one thing to perpetuate the hope, but today we have to see it in action. Special thanks for Inclinix, Udinix for their grassroots work from tenant empowerment, advocacy, to creating United Renters for Justice. Please give them a round of applause for their partnership with us today. Thank you. I have the honor and the pleasure to present to you our keynote speaker, Mr. Mark Charles. Mark Charles is a speaker, a writer, and a consultant who recently moved to Washington, D.C. from the Navajo Reservation. Mark seeks to understand the complexities of American history regarding race, culture, and faith in order to help forge a path of healing and reconciliation for the nation. He partners with numerous organizations to assist them in respectfully approaching, including, and working with Native communities. Mark is also the founder and the director of 5 Small Loaves, an organization that pursues racial reconciliation through the honest education, intentional conversations, and meaningful action. Under this organization, Mark has proposed the development of the Truth Commission to shed the light into the injustices perpetuated against Native Americans. Can we all welcome Mr. Mark Charles?
Yat-A. Yat-A. Mark Charles Yinashia. Sin beke dena nisle do tohaglini bashachin. Sin beke dena dashache do todachitni dashanella. In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you always give your 4 clans. We're a matrilineal people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. Now, my mother's mother happens to be American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Tsin Beke Dena. Translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My father's mother, my second clan, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Beke Dena. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Todachitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. Before I go any further, I want to just acknowledge that we are on the land of the Dakota. This was the native nation that lived here. They hunted here, they fished here, they farmed here, they raised their children here, they buried their dead here. This is the native nation whose society was here, and this is the native nation that was removed from these lands, ethnically cleansed from these lands, so that the state of Minnesota could be built and so that the city of Minneapolis could be founded. And wherever I go, I like to acknowledge the indigenous hosts of the land that I'm standing on. I do this because it's helpful to remember that these lands were not discovered. And it's also helpful to remember that there is a story, a legacy to these lands that predates what we've been taught in our history books. And so I just want to acknowledge the Dakota people, and I want to ask if there's anyone from the Dakota Nation who's here today, who's with us. Okay, that's fine. I like to ask just so I know who's in the room. I have to warn you, in the next 25 minutes, now probably 23 minutes, I'm going to be talking about a few things that many of you may not have heard before, and I'm going to bring some of our history down to a level that many of us have not discussed or else are very uncomfortable discussing. There may be some points during this presentation where you may want to stand up and walk out. There may be other points where you want to throw a muffin at me or something. I encourage you to resist both those urges. Keep your food on your table and stay in your seat. We're going to get to a better place, but there's a lot of things we have to discuss if we're really going to find a way to move forward. When I was asked to speak here, and I was looking at the organization that we're here for, which is Urban Homeworks, I was looking at your mission statement and your vision statement. And I want to start by talking about your vision statement. So your vision statement says, neighbors raising their collective voices to address injustice and overcome the barriers that perpetuate inequality. Now, I've served on my fair share of boards and organizations throughout my life, and rarely do I get really excited about a vision statement or a mission statement. But when I read this one, I was like, this is something I actually really, really affirm and I'm very excited about, because this statement is actually incredibly dangerous. And I love that. I love that it lays a foundation, it sets a vision for the organization that allows us to have some very complex and even difficult conversations. When you invite your neighbors in to talk about the injustice that perpetuates the inequality that they're facing, and you allow them to voice their concerns and to tell their stories and to bring their injustices to the light, that can be a very, very challenging conversation. And that's what I want to do for you today. I wanted to take about 15 minutes to talk about some of these injustices and the foundations of them, and then I want to use that to lead into a discussion of what do we do about them, both as followers of Jesus as well as people who want to help change the path of the inequality of our communities around us. So, in 1452, Pope Nicholas V wrote a papal bull titled Dum Diversas. And in it, he said, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively became known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human and their land is yours for the taking. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They did not believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in the New World that was already inhabited by millions and claimed to have discovered it. If you think about it, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your car keys, your laptops out. I will come by and discover them for you. Clearly, this is not discovery. This is stealing. This is conquering. It's colonizing. The fact that we have statues in New York City, in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, Illinois, we have a holiday on Monday that much of the nation will honor Columbus as the discoverer of America. This reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is that Native peoples, people of color, are not fully human. Now, the challenge is what we've done with this doctrine throughout our nation's history. So in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he said to the colonies that were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonists. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used this inclusive term, all men, is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. Now, a few years later, the Founding Fathers wrote another document. This one they began with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. But if you read the entire Constitution, and just go a few lines later down to Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 2 is the part of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not a part of the Union, who is and who is not covered by this document. And if you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you will note is that it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire Constitution from preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who does that leave? Well, technically, it was white landowning men who could vote. See, we don't think about this often enough. The reason we have a Constitution, the reason it was written, is to protect the interests of white landowning men. So we act surprised today that women earn 70 to 80 cents to the dollar. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's working. We act surprised our prisons are filled with people of color. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's working. Some of us get upset that in 2010, the Supreme Court sides with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals, opens the door for super PACs, unlimited support of candidates. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution is doing what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. Now, maybe you're thinking, whoa, Mr. Charles, we've corrected those things. Well, we've tried. About 50 years later, we passed the 13th Amendment. Most Americans think the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. But if you actually read the amendment, what it states is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So we've never abolished slavery. It's perfectly legal today under the jurisdiction of our criminal justice system. And today, the United States of America incarcerates its citizens at the highest rate of any country in the world. For every 100,000 citizens, we incarcerate 693 of them. That's 3 to 5 times higher than most of our allies, the other NATO nations. And when you break that number down by race, it's even worse. We incarcerate Hispanics, Latinos, and Native Americans at around the 800s, 8 to 900 range per 100,000, and we incarcerate African Americans at a rate of 1,206 per 100,000. Or 2,306 per 100,000. White Americans are incarcerated at a much more palatable rate of 450. So we just have to be honest. We've never abolished slavery. And to this day, we use the criminal justice system as a legal way to remove the civil rights of our people of color. Now, in 1823, there was a Supreme Court case. It was Johnson versus McIntosh. This is 2 white men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court, the John Marshall Court, had to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. They ruled that the principle was that discovery gave title to the land, and then they went on to reference this doctrine of discovery and stated that even though natives were here first, but because we are savages and less than human, we only have what's called the right of occupancy to the land. Like a fish would occupy water, a bird would occupy air, and Europeans would have the fee title to the land, the right of discovery to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. This case, along with a few others in the 1820s and 30s, create the legal precedent for land titles. This precedent and the doctrine of discovery get referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. In the 2005 case, in the late 1990s, the Oneida Indian Nation that had been removed from their lands in central state New York, they had been removed to Oklahoma. They went back and repurchased some of their traditional lands in the center of New York. They bought them on the open market, paid full price for them. And they wanted to exercise some of their traditional sovereignty over these lands. And so that meant they wouldn't pay taxes on them. Now, the lands they bought were within the city limits of the city of Sherrill of New York, and the city of Sherrill wanted their tax revenue, so they sued the Oneida Indian Nation in federal district court. And the court ruled in favor of the Oneida. And so the city of Sherrill appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, and the decision was upheld. So they appealed again to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court heard the case in the early 2000s and released their ruling in 2005. In the first footnote of the case, they reference the doctrine of discovery. They then go on to place the burden on the Oneida Indian Nation and said that because you've waited 250 years to seek relief in court, settlement has already moved in, which of course is white settlement. The city of Sherrill, the state of New York, have had jurisdiction over these lands for 250 years. It's passed through the hands of innumerable innocent purchasers, and you cannot reclaim sovereignty over these lands. You've waited too long. They then went back. So in 1823, when John Marshall was establishing the precedent of why natives could not have sovereignty over our own lands, he actually called us savages. He said, but the Indian tribes inhabiting these lands were fierce savages whose occupation was war and subsistence came primarily from the forest. To leave them in control of their own country, he said, would be to leave the country a wilderness. In 2005, the Supreme Court argued that, moreover, the lands in question have greatly increased in value since the Oneidas sold them 250 years ago, and they have become incorporated into cities like Sherrill and been converted from wilderness into these cities. They're using the exact same argument, just not using the word savages. So the Supreme Court concludes that based on the standards of federal Indian law, again, Article 1, or footnote 1, the Doctrine of Discovery, and federal equity practice, the Oneida Indian Nation cannot rekindle embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. See, when your land titles are propped up by a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, white supremacy becomes a bipartisan value. And our nation doesn't know how to talk about these things. We don't know how to talk about the roots of these problems. One of the issues that is of great concern within the Native community here, even in Minnesota, is called missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Where literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous women have been gone missing or they've been murdered, and society has responded with a collective shrug. Law enforcement is not following up. There's no accountability, there's no reporting. The families know they're gone, but nobody knows where they are, and society has responded with a collective shrug. In about a week, I will be back here talking or speaking at a protest about the mascots on the 24th when the Washington Redskins play the Minnesota Vikings, and there will be a protest before that game, and they've asked me to speak on it. When your Declaration of Independence, which is your statement of values, refers to natives as savages, and your Constitution never mentions women, and specifically excludes natives, you shouldn't be surprised when your Indigenous women go missing or get murdered and society doesn't care. And you shouldn't be surprised when the mascot of your nation's capital has a dehumanizing mascot that devalues the Indigenous peoples of this land. This is what happens when we have these types of foundations. Now, there was a whole other part of this history that I don't have time to go into about how these lands were taken and how the natives were removed from the lands. And I'll only share one quote with you to help you understand how deeply problematic the history of our nation is. And this is a quote that was given in 1851 by Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California. And in his first State of the State address, this is what he said. Let me just bring this up real quick so I don't misquote him. In his first State of the State address, he said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. Now, he's not saying a famine's broken out, it's not raining, we can't feed these people. He's not saying there's a disease that's broken out and we can't stop the spread of it. He's literally saying this exceptional white nation that has a manifest destiny cannot stop killing these people until they become extinct. And these are the challenges that we face. These are the questions we don't know what to do with. These are the things we don't know how to talk about. These are the stories that are behind the injustice and the inequality that our neighbors and our communities are facing. This is the root of the problem. When you have a house that's built on a bad foundation, you're going to get cracks in your walls, you're going to get gaps in your windows, you're going to have a creaky, crooked floor. And you can scream and fight and argue all you want about what color to paint the walls, what kind of caulking to use in your windowsills, and what kind of carpet to put on the floor. But until you go into the basement and examine the rot in your foundations, we're not going to know how to fix the problem. And we're never going to be able to fix the problem. And this is where it actually gets even more challenging. How much time do I have left? I have 5 minutes left. We have to wrap this up quickly. When Jesus came into this world, the people of Israel had what was called a land covenant with the God of Abraham, the God of Abraham. And this land covenant set up prosperity for them as their barometer of how they knew they were doing well in their following of God. If they were obedient, they were blessed, and they were thriving on their lands. If they were disobedient, they were exiled and removed from their lands. When Jesus came, he changed the barometer. And he said that blessed are you not when you prosper, but when you are persecuted. Blessed are you when people beat you and say all kinds of mean things against you. And then he went on to tell them that the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man, must suffer and die and be crucified. And this so was contrary to the expectations the people of Israel had of the Messiah that Peter took his own teacher aside and began to rebuke him. And Jesus rebuked him back and began to teach him that the Son of Man and his disciples must embrace this barometer of persecution. And the disciples fought against it even through his death all the way up until Pentecost. And finally at Pentecost, when they received the Holy Spirit, they embraced this new barometer of persecution, and almost all of the disciples went on to die a martyr's death. This went up until the 4th century when he had the great persecution. And Eusebius, who was the bishop of Caesarea, was writing a book called Ecclesiastical History. And he was recording the history of the church from the birth of Jesus through the 4th century. And he was lifting up the martyrs as the heroes of the church. But then in chapter 8, in book 8, he begins to introduce this new character called Constantine, who he calls an emperor blessed by God and ordained by God, and I'm paraphrasing, for such a time as this. And he begins to prop him up as a God-ordained savior of the church and of Christians. And he feeds this lie of a Christian empire to Constantine. And Constantine bites, and when after the Battle at Milvian Bridge, he creates this Christian empire, and he converts all of Rome to Christianity. And he ends the persecution of the church. Now, Jesus was absolutely opposed to Christian empire. He said, my kingdom is not of this earth, my kingdom is from somewhere else. And he refused to try and create a Christian empire to allow his disciples to do the same. But when Eusebius fed the heresy of Christian empire to Constantine, and Constantine bit and created Christian empire, now suddenly we had this church that was no longer about losing its life, but about saving its life. And if you want to create a Christian empire, which is contrary to the teachings of Jesus, the first thing you have to do is write Christ out of ecclesiastical history. And if you read all 11 volumes of ecclesiastical history written by Eusebius, you would think, if you were writing a book called The History of the Church, that your book would never have a conclusion, right? Because if you're writing about the history of the church will conclude when the bridegroom returns. And so you're merely writing the preface to a very long saga that you are just a part of the beginning of. But when you read the final chapter of the final book of ecclesiastical history, you will find Eusebius absolutely has a conclusion, and his conclusion is the salvation that comes to Rome, not through Christ, but through Constantine. Again, because if you want to create a Christian empire, you have to write Christ out of ecclesiastical history. And this is what allowed for the church to go from the teachings of Jesus, which talked about suffering and dying and being persecuted, to writing a doctrine of discovery that allowed the church now to kill its enemy and subjugate those who were not like them. And this is what allowed for the genocide and ethnic cleansing and history of slavery that went throughout our nation. And this is what allows our nation to hold on to this mythology that we are a Christian empire, even though we have a very dehumanizing and genocidal past. And so what we need to do, and I want to go back to your mission statement now, because your mission statement says, the mission of Urban Homeworks is to perpetuate the hope of Jesus Christ through the innovative community development. Your vision calls you to hear the stories that perpetuate injustice against your neighbors. And your vision, or your mission, puts the focus and the center back on Christ. The solution is not going to come through a Christian empire. The solution is not going to come through legislating our theologies. The solution is not going to come through converting this nation. The United States of America is not, never has been, nor will it ever be Christian. The church is called to be Christian. The church is called to be a witness. The church is called to be prophetic. And your mission statement, I love it because it puts the focus back not on the institutional church, not on trying to make a Christian empire. Your mission statement puts your focus back on Christ. And the reason we're in the problematic state we're in today is because the church wrote Christ out of ecclesiastical history, and we need to find a way to put him back in it. Without Christ, it will be incredibly difficult to go back and face this history and to deal with these problems. It is wonderful that this organization is dealing with homelessness, but if you don't also deal with the systemic injustice of how that land was stolen in the first place, you're not going to fix the problem. There are layers upon layers upon layers of injustice in our nation and in our world. And we need to, again, to not just fix the cracks in the wall and the gaps in the windows and the creaky, crooked floor. As Christians, because we know Christ, because we are covered by the blood of Christ, we can have the courage to go down into the basement and examine the foundations, and to ask our Lord and our Savior, to ask the God of creation, how do we fix these problems? There's no easy solution I can give you today, but I love your vision statement and I love your mission statement because it allows you to hear the stories of the problem and it puts the focus back on Christ, which is the only way we're going to get to a very good solution. Thank you for inviting me here today. Thank you for allowing me to talk about some unsettling truths. And I use that term because I have a new book that just came out called Unsettling Truth. Thank you.
He stole my thunder because I sure was getting ready to promote his new book. Once again, he is finally today is the first day that the book is released, and it's called The Unsettling Truth. Can we give Mr. Mark Charles another round of applause? All right, we're going to take a few minutes to take a look at another brief video, and then we will be opening up with the introduction of our Executive Director, Chad Switters.
Home means to me that we have security. This is a place that we can come and be safe, and we can pray and play together and eat together as a family.
It's togetherness, it's community.
It's just love and connectivity.
Peace, quiet.
Family, rest, regroup.
It's a place to build community. Without having a home, it's almost impossible to do anything. Work, go to school, provide for your family, be a family.
Housing is a basic need. We as an organization, as a community, need to make sure that every person has a place to call home.
Even if ain't nothing but a one bedroom, that's still home.
Affordable housing, it makes the family whole. It's gonna take all of us to bring all of our ideas and all of our collective voices and all of our collective resources to make for sure that we produce and provide more affordable housing for sustainability.
It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Chad Switters, our 20-year leader of Urban Home Works. I am excited to introduce Chad because I met him several years ago in North Minneapolis when we were picking up the pieces following a major tragedy, the tornado, in our community. You see, I claim Minneapolis as my home because it was the neighborhood who gave me my start. One thing that I noticed when Chad and I first met was Chad's commitment to make a difference, not just verbally, but in action. He's still making a difference today, one nail at a time, partnering with Hope and building upon the hidden gems in the community, which are families, neighbors, and partners. Thank you, Chad, for helping many live out their dreams. Welcome, Chad Switters.
Well, thank you, Mark and Paula, and thank you all for being here today. We want to call out a few thank yous to some folks. First of all, I just want to say thanks to the Urban Homework staff and team, the board of directors for all your diligent hard work over the years and for pulling this event off. So if you could just stand up real quick, board and staff, and give us a little round of applause for them. I'd especially like to thank our leading contributors and sponsors to this event, the John W. Moody Foundation, Tradition Capital Bank, and Northern Trust. Thank you for underwriting and making it possible to be here today. And I hear we have a couple of elected officials in the room, so I want to, give deference to them. St. Paul City Council member Mitra Nelson, Minneapolis Council President Lisa Bender, and Brooklyn Center Mayor Mike Elliott. Thank you for your service. In August of this year, I celebrated my 20-year work anniversary at Urban Homeworks. I feel like I should say thank you to Sheila for sticking in there for all that time, too. And over the years, I've had a chance to field some questions about what is it going to take to really hit the tipping point here? What's it going to take to solve this affordable housing problem? Or what's it going to take to really make a difference? And frankly, I can't be honest with you about my answers or my reflections on those questions without going way back to the cause. And I can't be honest about what that root cause looks like without grappling with these issues of time and capital and who got to be human enough along the way. And as Mark talked about and explained, I can't really get to that without recognizing that there's a faulty view of God that is right behind this old doctrine of discovery that's got us to where we are. And that faulty view is in direct conflict with the Jesus that's in our mission statement. As old Bob Dylan, an old university guy, once sang, everybody's got to serve somebody. So how that doctrine reflected God shaped the attitudes and drove the actions of people for centuries. And I'm convinced that it's these attitudes and behaviors that are precisely what needs to be addressed to reprioritize resources and redesign systems in order to form more meaningful solutions and bring them to scale. Ched Myers, a writer and scholar and theologian, once said, "Bad Bible study is not a victimless crime." The bad Bible study of our Western European ancestors in Western European Christendom led to some sanctioning on this faulty view of God's behalf the annihilation and domination and enslavement and conquest of other human beings. That is some bad Bible study. And we're here today, we're here to do better. And that's why we mixed it up a little bit this year, so that we can dig a little deeper and face the truths that are often ignored and silenced. That we might imagine and animate a more healthy, robust society and country that works for all of us, not just some. So whether you're a person of faith or not, this stuff has shaped our collective context. And some of us would like to pretend this ugliness just didn't exist and practice that fine art of denial. And some of us would like to package it up and shove it through that good-bad binary and just set it aside or sweep it under the rug as bad. And some would like to minimize it and just hope it somehow goes away. But to do that is like getting critically ill and not wanting to go here and address the diagnosis or even try to pretend that it's not that big a deal, even if there was a chance for recovery. There is no pathway toward health without first admitting there's a disease. In contrast to the doctrines God, at the root of Urban Homeworks lies this radical, embracing, empowering, illuminating, and liberating understanding of God as shown in the life of Jesus Christ. And that's the connection. Everybody's got to serve somebody. And who I choose to serve shapes how I treat my neighbor and navigate difference. Kate, my 14-year-old daughter, who is really upset that she's in my talk today, came to me the other day looking for some help on a paper she was writing about worldviews. And one of the questions she needed to grapple with in her paper was the role that conflict played in understanding worldviews. Conflict, tension, friction. As that old law of physics might suggest, any movement creates friction, whether two surfaces or worldviews or ideologies. No conflict, no friction. No friction, no movement. And that friction always generates heat. And that heat can be used for more than one purpose. For some, it could be used to burn one another at the stake, and for others to cook up something that is nourishing and energizes everybody to help understand one another more deeply. The Jesus mission statement found in Luke 4 includes this little statement, and it's recovery of sight to the blind. And then he puts that statement between two slices of clarification that talk about release from the captives and freedom to the prisoner. Once we see one another, we see how we've organized our thinking in our systems of captivity and oppression and prison, and then we can deal with them. We can't work on a problem that we can't see, whether we're blind to it or blinded by it. Jesus then wraps that up in a neat little package with two more statements that evokes this old idea of the year of Jubilee. If you remember what happens in the year of Jubilee, every 50 years, God pretty much said, hit the socioeconomic reset button, land returns to its rightful owners, slaves are set free, and debts are forgiven. And that's the kind of good news, Jesus says, that I have come to proclaim. And it's specifically and especially good news for the poor. I have found that as I more deeply see people over this last 20 years, I also can't help but see the systems that are causing the pain and trauma more clearly as well. And as those systems seem to be the same today as they were in the time of Jesus, and they tend to revolve around land, labor, and capital. Jesus took on the work of addressing these systems that exploited people while trying to live an alternative. And that's the Jesus in our mission statement that we hope to try to perpetuate. I see one another through the lens of my own worldview and perspective. My worldview is shaped and reinforced and challenged by the stories I tell myself and the stories I tell about people who are different than I am. So I'd like to point out there's this little framework that I placed on all of, or that we put on your, I can't take credit for putting them on the tables myself. I didn't do that. But they're on your tables. And this is a framework that's helped me kind of look at my own language and look at the stories that I'm hearing. And it was written by Joseph Leakey and Cecilia Clegg in their book, Moving Beyond Sectarianism, Religion, Conflict, and Reconciliation in Northern Ireland. So for time's sake, I'm just going to read these 11 points, but I want you to take some time at some point, take it with you, and reflect on this, especially some of the subpoints under number 3. So there's an 11-point scale. It's called of sectarian danger that leads to violence. Number 1, we are different, we believe differently. Number 2, we are right. Number 3, we are right and you are wrong. Number 4, you are a less adequate version of what we are. Number 5, you are not what you say you are. In fact, number 6, we are what you say you are. Number 7, what you are doing is evil. Number 8, you are so evil you forfeit ordinary rights. Number 9, you are less human. Number 10, you are evil. And number 11, you are demonic. Demons tend to get exorcised, whether figuratively or literally. I'd suggest that the closer we are to number 11 is the closer we are to serving the God represented in that doctrine of discovery. And the closer we are to number 1 is the closer we are to that Jesus in Luke 4. Descending down the scale uses the heat of friction and ideological movement for burning one another at the stake rather than cooking up something nourishing and health-bringing. Descending down the scale inhibits my ability to recover from my blindness, to see my neighbor, to practice jubilee and participate in the good news. Descending down that slippery slope of sectarian danger obfuscates clouds, and it is so easy to do. But ascending takes work. It takes effort and development. Ascending goes against the grain of human nature, the grain of tribalism and fear and freezing and fighting and fleeing. Ascending represents the God of MLK, Reverend Chapman, Reverend Galloway, Reverend Cowmeadow, Mark Charles, the kind of God that we aspire to in our mission statement. We are not only dealing with a racialized housing gap or wealth gap. We are not only dealing with a racialized achievement gap or employment gap. We are dealing with the repercussions of a murderous mindset. We are dealing with the effects of capital, land, labor, and cash, accumulating and transferring from generation to generation with its venture capital, its seed money, being extracted from the unwilling, uncompensated, unrecognized investment of indigenous genocide, theft of land and natural resources, and African genocide and slavery. And in order to pull this off, our founders, and all too often us, slide down that slippery scale of sectarian danger and rationalize the dehumanization of indigenous, black, and brown people and squash their voices. This is not America bashing or hating on the United States. And I'm not being anti-American. I am trying to be mature enough to admit that we need to take our United States of America to the doctors like Mark Charles, and begin to be open and willing to hearing the diagnosis so that healing and wellness can emerge. As a country, unfortunately, we were born pretty sick. I don't think we were stillborn, but we were awfully sick. And dealing with that disease and taking actions towards a reimagined American dream is way overdue, or the symptoms of housing and education and academic achievement and employment and health are just going to persist. Now, couple this idea of the doctrine of discovery with how capital works. If someone invested the equivalent of $100 on Independence Day 1776 at 5% interest with no allowance for inflation or anything else, that would be worth a little over $14 million today. $100. Time and capital are inextricably linked in a system of capitalism. So as I think about solutions, I have to hold in mind that one of the building blocks in our country's foundation is not just that some people had the ability to access and benefit from the time value of money and compounding interest, but that other people from whom the land and labor came from did not and were systemically excluded from that system. It took us conservatively 300 years to get here. I don't think it's possible, nor fair, nor constructive to expect people to just grab a job or get a job and catch up or just pull themselves up by their bootstraps without taking into sound account the compounding factor of time. To do so would be like suffering from economic amnesia, just forgetting that one of the critical factors in our capital equation because it's just too uncomfortable or too costly. And I'd argue it's way, way too costly already. Another example of how this ties to capitalism is when a few people have a lot of capital and extraordinary returns over a short period of time. So for example, it's estimated there are 3 families in the United States that have had an over 6,000% return on their assets since 1982. That's about 167% return per year. So if I invested $1,000 with these 3 families in 1982 and got 167% return on my investment, that would be worth $6,038 million today. Now keep in mind, during that same time frame, median household wealth went down 3%. Capital begets capital. And that means for Americans with no capital, the system of capitalism isn't going to work very well. It's time to adapt the system so that it does. As the quote goes, the current system was exquisitely designed to produce its current results. Time for a design change. So I'm kind of starting to view capitalism kind of how Winston Churchill described democracy, when he said, "Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time." And so I think capitalism may be the worst form of economic system except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. It is a tool in our hands that we have created to serve us, not the other way around. It's time to adapt the design for a different result. So now what? Now what do we do? And on a personal level, individual level, I want to encourage and implore you to follow the model of Jesus, of that old prophetic tradition, where he lived out and he practiced solidarity with people who were oppressed, and he spoke truth to power. We recover our sight, humanize one another, practice mutual aid and jubilee as a statement and model to those who are more powerful than us to heed and to follow. We invite, we compel, we ask people to bring themselves and their resources to the table. We optimize within our constraints in such a way that it serves as a challenge and a protest to the constraint itself. We give, we lend, we help, we donate, we volunteer where we can, and we participate in making our system better. At a systems level, I think this is probably above my pay grade. And the views expressed in the next few sentences aren't necessarily the views of Urban Homeworks' staff and board of directors. But at a systems level, because of the history and the vast wealth that's been accumulated by a very few, I just can't help but support ideas and policies that address that wealth gap. And I'm not a politician and I don't play one on TV, but if we could pair up some compassionate philanthropy with funds that can bring some of those dollars back into play, I can't help but think we can't make some significant progress in the current need and start making some repairs for the history that we've gone through. At Urban Homeworks, we're trying to affect some change within our constraints through land and housing, trying to create stable places for rental and ownership for people to land and get their feet under them so that they can be present and have their voice heard, like you heard about in the workshop earlier. We're continuing to work to address some of the worst run rental property in our community, trying to force landlords to either comply with minimum dignity and stability standards or to help nudge them out of business. We're innovating in healthy, durable construction technology to bring those long-term benefits to people who need them the most. And we're trying to do this by continually tying it back to that long history and that long challenge and undo some of this systemic, historic damage. So I invite you to do what you can, to give generously and meaningfully, to open up your checkbooks and pocketbooks, or to type in this website that's up on our screen, www.urbanhomeworks.com/donate. And at the same time, to open up your heart and mind and engage difference in a more robust, healthy, meaningful way, so that our world might live into something better than it's been. So Reverend Haywood, my boss, is back, and we'll give you a few instructions, and then we'll give you a few awkward moments to fill in those cards and stuff, and she'll close our time.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to say this. I rather coined a statement about Urban Homeworks and Chad's work, and I said I'd rather see a man act on the hope than listen to him talk about it. So now, table hosts, you have some work to do. I would like the table hosts to find a white envelope that is in the center of your table and distribute the donation envelopes that are inside of it to each guest at your table. And guest, we would like you to take the opportunity to use the donation envelopes or go to the website that Chad has already said to make a gift to Urban Homeworks today. We will take cash, check, or credit card, and it can be used through the donation envelope. Table hosts, I would like you to collect all of the donations from your table guests, place it inside the larger envelope, and then seal the envelope, and then wait for Urban Homeworks staff to collect these from you following the lunch program. So we're going to give you a few minutes to work it out. All right, and so as you are filling out your envelopes, for those who have pre-registered for the Affordable Housing Panel, as soon as you're finished, would you please navigate to the Johnson Great Room at this time, or as soon as you finish it? And if you're not sure if you pre-registered, there should be a black dot on your name tag indicating that you have registered for this. And if you would like to attend the panel but did not pre-register, please wait outside of the Johnson Great Room to make sure that all the seats are, if there's any seats that are available, we can have you seated. There will also be a Q&A session with Mark Charles in the Sky Yuma room following the program, and no pre-registration is required to attend this. I want to thank you very, very much for all of your help, your contributions, and being here with us this afternoon. Thank you.